Usher in Daniel 11, Part 2. In the vision of Daniel chapter 11, from the 5th verse, we see the transition from 4 leaders of the Grecian Empire down to just 2, Ptolemy I and Seleucus I. Ptolemy took his position of power in Egypt and received his title King of the South. The Prince Seleucus finally takes his title King of the North after securing 3 territories. His first territory was taken in 301 BC at the Battle of Ipsus. He then took his second territory in the west in 286 BC. His third and final stepping stone to supreme dominion was secured in 281 BC when he defeated Lysimachus in the north. Having taken the rest of the Grecian Empire in 3 formidable steps, Seleucus, the king of the north, was now in supremacy and strong above the king of the south. The book of Daniel has a reputation for repetition, and moving forward in time we can see that a striking similarity occurs in Daniel chapter 7 when a little horn plucks up 3 territories in order to begin his great dominion. The little horn of Daniel chapter 7 was fulfilled by the papacy, who by the year 538 AD had plucked up 3 barbarian nations which stood in its way of reigning supremely. This began the great or supreme dominion of the papacy for a period of 1260 years called the Dark Ages. Back in Daniel chapter 11, the king of the north, after taking his 3 territories, then reigns undisturbed for the next 35 years. The vision then moves on to a peace agreement between the king of the north and the king of the south by a token of marriage. This peace treaty occurred in the year 252 BC towards the closing years of the king of the north's undisturbed reign. Berenice, the king of the south's daughter, was married to Antiochus, the king of the north. However, the marriage did not last long, and neither did the treaty. The household of Berenice from the south was given up or slain by the treacherous Laodice from the north. The treaty was over. In the repeat of history, we also find a peace treaty towards the end of the Dark Ages of the papal supremacy. This peace treaty was made between the papacy and revolutionary France called the Treaty of Tolentino in 1797. However, after Dufort, an important French general, was fatally wounded in December 1797 by papal troops, the treaty was over, and in retaliation, General Berthier was charged to march upon Rome. So too, in Daniel 11, the king of the south, now Ptolemy Euergetes, which was Ptolemy I's grandson, takes revenge for the death of his sister Berenice and marches on the king of the north with an army. Ptolemy Euergetes, the king of the south, finds that on entering the dominion of the king of the north, his army is unopposed, and some key leaders of the king of the north are taken captive without war or battle, and much later Seleucus Callinicus himself dies in exile. In a similar manner, General Berthier enters Rome with his army in 1798 and is unopposed. The Pope is taken captive without war or battle and eventually dies in exile. And just as Ptolemy carried away silver and gold and other precious vessels back to Egypt after the attack, so General Berthier carried away a large amount of treasure and works of art from the Vatican back to France. Daniel's reputation for repetition is not only seen in parallel chapters of Daniel, but within Daniel chapter 11 itself. Daniel 11 verse 40 describes the king of the south pushing at the king of the north at the time of the end. A careful trace of the time of the end in Daniel and Revelation points to the time of the end of the papacy's reign in 1798. Therefore, the history of Daniel chapter 11 verses 7 to 9 describing Ptolemy's attack on Seleucus is clearly repeated in the history of the first part of Daniel 11 verse 40, when revolutionary France pushes against the papacy, inflicting the deadly wound of 1798. In summary, the history of Daniel chapter 11 in verses 4 to 5 foreshadows the rise of a later king of the north, the papacy, and points to how the papacy would conquer 3 nations in order to ascend to supreme dominion in 538 AD. The history of verse 6 then foreshadows the peace agreement between the king of the north and the king of the south in 1797 under the Treaty of Tolentino. And the history of verses 7 to 9 points us to the first portion of Daniel 11 verse 40, when atheistic France pushes at the papacy and takes the Pope captive in 1798, carrying him away along with the other treasures of Rome back to France. This similarity within Daniel 11 itself shows us that the end of Daniel's vision can be understood from the beginning of the chapter. It indicates that the history of the king of the north and the king of the south in verses 5 to 9 is sequentially carrying us through a later history of the king of the north and the king of the south as we come nearer to our time. As the king of the south and the king of the north today engage in a fierce and deadly conflict, the question is, are you right with God? Russia in Daniel 11, end of part 2.